the concept of social dissonance takes the notion of cognitive dissonance from Leon Fetzinger, which is the tension that arises when somebody has two different cognitions, or the discrepancy between what one, the values that one person has and what one actually does. So the clear example is, if you don't want to smoke, you don't want to smoke, you don't want to smoke, but then you smoke. And then you always try to find justifications in order to avoid this tension. So social dissonance is a cognitive dissonance at the structural level that has to do with the discrepancy that exists in Western liberal societies between the values that we promote and what we do. So the values that are promoted have to do with individual freedom, equality, autonomy. What are the three of them? Individual freedom, equality, democracy, and more recently, sustainability. And what we actually do in our practical daily life is to reproduce a system that is based on exploitation and freedom and the destruction of the planet to the extraction for profit. So how this came to be, and this is the kind of main question that I'm trying to answer. So I think the justifications that they have to do with, first, something that has occurred, or a kind of perception that has developed since the 60s, or maybe more specifically after May 68, which is very well synthesized with the notion of Mark Fisher of capital realism, which, by quoting Frederick Jameson, this quote really synthesized this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than that of liberalism, that of capitalism. So the idea that there is no way out, that we are stuck, that there is no possibility of doing things otherwise. So liberal democracies is the best that we can aim for. And so this is a structural form of justification that somehow forecloses the possibility of having a collective horizon that could change the way that we do things. But this also is, this structural justification is based upon another much more intimate form of justification, which is to buy the idea of liberalism that we as individuals themselves are already subjects, that we have the capacity for self-determination, the capacity to act. And it seems that we are not willing to give this extremely limited form of individual freedom that we have in order to basically produce something else, or be able to try something that would have a different conception of the subject to the one that we have now. So this is the kind of premise that that I come from, and the kind of the starting point, and maybe just to point out as a kind of as a way to say, why is it so difficult? Why it is so difficult to think that something could be otherwise? And this has very well put in a recent text by Ray Brassier, who is somebody who I'm very close, and I guess most of you already know, because I guess I heard that he was part of Foreign Object before. And in this text, the politics of rift, he brings the idea of the antinomy of class struggle, which is a difficult situation that we find ourselves in, which is that the more wealth labor obtains from capital, the more labor is exploited by capital. So the more that we try to get better conditions under capitalism, the more that capital needs to actually extract our labor power. So it's as then Ray says in this text a bit later on. So the subjectivity of labor is trapped between aspiring to the dominant status of the bourgeoisie and affirming its objective status in the social order. It aspires because it is subordinated, and it is subordinated because it aspires. This deadlock converts the consciousness of social being into its affirmation, preventing consciousness of class from issuing into the imperative negation of class. So it's like we are trapped in this deadlock of not being able to produce a form of negation that could negate ourselves as labor power. That's, in these conditions, the only thing that we can be, apparently. And that's this foreclosed perspective on the future is what makes it extremely, that we find ourselves in these catastrophic times. So what I'm going to do is to just basically very briefly present you the way that I divided the book previously, and then I will go into tell you about kind of the two main references which were in the reading list, which was Sylvia Wynter's text, Rethinking Aesthetics Towards a Deciphering Practice, and Thomas Menzinger text on mental actions. So once again, I'm kind of playing with this structural, more structural kind of forms of conditioning, and the more kind of going into the smaller kind of unit of, coming from the individual. What do we mean by the individual, and how is it that we have this, we come up with this idea that as individuals we are already subjects, that we conflate the idea of the individual with that of selfhood, and with believing that we already have subjective agency, which is what has been produced, since the Enlightenment, but more specifically in liberalism, and now in neoliberalism. These times is kind of cracking up, because the conditions that are supposed to produce enough equality for us to feel that we have some level of agency, of material agency, are getting totally decimated. Therefore, that's why I think we are at an acute moment where the social dissonance is very present, and it prevails in this society. So I'll start by sharing the screen. And okay. Wow. Can you see the screen? Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you so much. So I'll see if I can put it in full screen. My program is is not working perfectly. So just bear with me for a second. I hope it didn't get stuck. It crashed. So sorry. This computer is doing strange things, and somehow with this program, it really it takes its time. Okay, so here it is. So basically, the way that I divided sorry. Okay, the way that I divided the book mostly is, well, in 3 sections. The first 2 that are more theoretical have to do, they are, the first section is alienation from below, which produces an spectral objectivity. And the second one is the one that I call alienation from, sorry, this is the problem of doing things last minute. This one is actually alienation from above, please excuse me, and it produces an spectral objectivity. And the other one is alienation from below, which produces a phantom. Bloody hell! I have to apologize for not checking these things properly. I was doing as I said. This is a bit embarrassing. I was just finishing this subject. So basically, yeah, there is like these 2 notions, and so the first one is, and these are forms of reification, meaning they are processes that then we reify into a thing that we take as natural, that we naturalize. And the first one has to do with the way that commodity production works, and the way that it shapes reality. So basically, in commodity production, we put our labor power, and I don't know if this got stuck, or can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so sorry, this program is rough, the one that I'm using for the presentation. So basically, there is these 2 kind of reifying moments. One that is more structural, and it has socio-political and economical, and the other one that it has to do with neurocomputational mechanisms and subpersonal mechanisms that arises from our bodies, but then they meet also this spectral objectivity that comes into being through the capitalist mode of production. So, and for me, these are the seeds. This is where why the social dissonance kind of emerges. So the first one has to do with the way that commodity production works, in the way that we objectified our labor, and in an extremely complex process, then the commodities get rid of any particular qualities that we put into the labor process, and it produces kind of moments of general equivalence that can be abstract, that they are abstracted, and by that they produce this, through this abstraction, through the subsumption of labor, they produce value. And in this process of subsumption, we lose the relationship that we have both to that production, but also in the way that then it comes back in a commodity. We don't have access through experience to what is it that then a commodity is. It appears to us as something natural and immediate, but we cannot understand the complexity of how this commodity has been produced. So there is a noise, a form of noise that we cannot access in order to know the complexity of the reality that we are producing. But it appears to us as something that we need to make sense. We make sense of it. And already George Lukács in 1923 was already able to point to this process of reification. And I read, the character of the commodity, the abstract quantitative mode of calculability, shows itself here in its spirit's form. The reified mind necessarily sees as in the form in which its own authentic immediacy becomes manifest, and as a reified consciousness does not even attempt to transcend it. On the contrary, it is concerned to make it permanent by scientifically deepening the laws at work. Just as the capitalist system continuously produces and reproduces itself economically on higher and higher levels, the structure of reification progressively sinks more deeply, more faithfully, and more definitely into the consciousness of man. So, and I think I want to pause here in the moment of authentic immediacy, that's what we get in everyday experience. A feeling that we know what a commodity is, an object with clearly demarcations of what is inside and outside, but that we actually do not know, we cannot comprehend how the value of this commodity is produced. Capitalism does this perverse thing in which we believe to be the subjects through all the kind of legal structures that we have in order to freely sell our labor, as if we were autonomous individuals with certain level of agency. We think that we are the ones that are in charge by either buying commodities or engaging with them. But basically what is really happening is that we are moved by commodities and the ideology that it promotes, i.e. selflessness and profit. So the subject seems to me is much more the subject that is able to determine reality seems that is much more likely to be capital that one, that the subjects that we are supposed to be ourselves, that at this present moment. So this is a kind of a structure, this is a kind of the way that we are perceiving a reality that is full of spectrality, that there is something there that we cannot access because they're extremely social complexes, full of noise, but we have to make rational sense of what is it that we are doing, and also of ourselves. So how do we believe ourselves to be? So the book arises from my engagement with the concepts of alienation. And while the notion of alienation in Marx and in Marxism has been greatly explored, what I haven't seen is a notion of alienation that take current scientific research and discoveries for example, in neuroscience, as a ways of showing that we don't really know what we are, or that our perception of ourselves is very different to what might actually be happening or is happening at the material level. So by looking at the work of Thomas Metzinger, I found another form of alienation, which is called alienation from below, and produces a phantom subjectivity. So in his book, Being No One, the Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity in 2003, he points out at this other form of reification. And this is the one that it comes from the idea of the self-model that we produce. With the self-model as a kind of projection that our brain produces, that it feels so transparent and natural that we cannot see it as that projection. And this self-model is based upon what, and now I read, it is the environs of bodily self-awareness, of agency and autobiographical memory, which constitutes the conscious experience of an enduring self. The conceptual reification of what actually is a very unstable and episodic process is then reiterated by the phenomenological fallacy, pervading almost all folk psychological and a large position of philosophical discourse on self-consciousness. But it's not even phenomenologically false. We are not things, but processes. So here we have ways in which, in order to, because we cannot engage with the complexity of the neurocomputational costs that our brain is involved in, we reified these processes into kind of a model in which we can basically generate enough level of agency and a perception of where we can place ourselves in the world in order to function. But this, when it meets the reality that I described previously, I are engaging with commodity production, generates a very distorted perception, distorted form of reality that we cannot, that we are now, I think we're in a moment where just things are really crackling, and then I will explain why I think this is the case. But what I want to do now is to update these two levels, one that we can say that is more structural, of this alienation from above, and this one I want to update as a way to try to decipher what social dissonance is I want to update it with thinking of Sylvia Wynter, this text on rethinking aesthetics, notes towards a deciphering practice, which gave me a very impressive perspective on why the origins of how is it come to, how is it that we got to this point where there is this perception, we have this perception of the subject as individual with the possibility of producing agency and, you know, producing democracy. But we, you know, what is actually happening in reality, you know? So this idea of deciphering, which she is looking at the way that aesthetics, the role that aesthetics, how aesthetics functions, by trying to interrogate what aesthetics actually does rather than what it says it does. And this, for me, is a crucial point that I'll try to bring it into as a way to try to understand what actually social dissonance is and why does it emerges. And on the point of alienation from below, I want to take into account the current research that Thomas Metzinger is doing following predictive processing, which maybe with Inigo, you already look at some of these, right? Is that right, that you were looking in the last 2 weeks at predictive processing? Well, yeah, anyway, I'll try to explain, yeah, this. So basically, the way that for me, Sylvia Wynter, which was a Jamaican Cuban essayist, writer, philosopher, and yeah, extremely interesting figure, very influenced by the idea of sociogeny by Franz Fanon, which I will go into it. The way that she goes into her work and the way that she explains why is it that through modernism, since the Enlightenment, through modernity, with the development of social science, we have developed kind of conception of the human that on the appearance produced to be this idea of the universal human, which we all are, to a certain, made equal, but actually in reality, it was producing an extremely unequal society and segregating, different individuals and different forms of life by deciding who can be a human and who cannot be a human. And the way that, she looks at aesthetics in a very radical way by kind of attacking the idea of autonomy in a powerful, in a way that I find it extremely impressive. So she poses this question of what does aesthetics do? And I'll read. We can now answer the question, what does aesthetic do? By defining its phenomenon as instituted by each cultural imaginary, as the imperative enactment of each governing code of subject, object, of symbolic life and death, and therefore of non-genetic and symbolic modes of psycho-affective altruism, aggregating of all human orders up to and including that of our own present nation state. Consequently, because it is clearly the very condition of existence of all human forms of life, and of the role allocating and cohering principles aggregative of their modes of a specific ultra sociality, the category of the aesthetic is the determinant in place of the human nature of liberal humanism, of the mode of production of humanism, and of the patriarchy of feminism, of the ensemble of collective behaviors, means of which each of human order affects its autopoiesis as a living and self-organizing cybernetic system. So the question is like, how is it that it produces such a coherent system that, it becomes like a kind of a totalizing perspective in which it describes and portrays what social individual is. And this kind of reminds me very much to the notion of social synthesis by Shaum Mehra and friend Shaum Mehra, which is in the way that how it has to do with the relationship between the forms of thought and how they relate to the social forms, and the way that it generates a coherent whole in which we all seem to just basically accept and take part of it, and even though there are forms of antagonisms, but they are obviously not enough to break through this coherent whole. And so this approach to aesthetics, I find it extremely important, and especially for me, since I'm also an artist and musician. And I think that through experience or questioning what experience is, we can actually try to understand how this idea of coherence of the whole is produced. And for her, the way that this coherence is produced is through what she calls the semantic closure principle, which is because it is a function of the securing of the modes of social cohesion based on the inducing of cultural specific cooperative behaviors on the part of its human subjects. The phenomenon of aesthetics and its discursive semantic practice or rhetorical strategies by means of whose meaning signals such as altruistic behaviors are stably induced and must be governed by rules at the level of human forms of life that are analogous to the rules which govern the securing of cooperative coherence at the level of organic life, rules which must all function. Therefore, according to the semantic closure principle, which alone ensures such a coherence. So it's like at the level of the semantic level, at the semantic level, there is a kind of everything kind of makes sense in order to produce and portray a certain perception of what a form of life is. And in doing this, it segregates into what forms of life can be accepted and what other forms of life will be disregarded. So, and the great thing about her is that she goes back to, she's really willing to go to analyze from different periods and from these different disciplines, from natural science to popular culture. But for example, in order to bring this point of who gets disregard, she points at the way that in the Middle Ages, the leopard, the one who has leper will be the one that is kind of dismissed from society, or the mad. And in this society, in today's society, will be the poor or the jobless or the homeless. That there is always society, always, and it tends to produce these forms of segregation. But on the other hand, it gives and produces this appearance that we can, or many of us are actually part of this idea of what the human is. But we know that this, by accepting this idea of the human, the individual subject, we are reproducing a system that is producing extreme forms of exploitation. So for her, what we really need is a deciphering practice, which, and I start to read. So a deciphering practice, therefore, sets out to take the image, sound, signifying practices of film and television as the objects of a new mode of inquiry, one that will and can, in the words of Hans Pagels, erase the traditional barriers between the natural science and the humanities, in order to make our narratively constructed worlds and the behavior regulating orders on feelings and beliefs, in other words, our cultural imaginaries, subject to scientific description in a new way. Such a practice will reveal the rules of functioning rather than merely replicate and perpetuate these rules. So obviously we need to, in order to try to make sense how this whole this semantic closure principle, how it is produced at the structural level, we need to try to find out, we need to take whatever, any kind of elements that we have at hand in order to understand how they correlate. We cannot accept any kind of disciplinary division if we want to kind of have a perspective that will give us the chance to understand how this semantic closure principle works. So a deciphering practice, and this, I continue just by continuing what she means by deciphering. A deciphering practices rejection of the ontocentric definition of the human, and therefore of the Cartesian and Darwinian premises of any purposes given to humans by nature, rather than by the discursive calm neurochemical signaling systems by which we are instituted as a mega-organic form of life, proposes that human purposes, like the modes of the subject of sociogeny, of which they correlate, also to be seen as alterable to the extent that they have proved to be inconsiderate, both for the human species as a whole, witnessed the ongoing deterioration of the set of conditions of the planetary environment by means of which the species is alone viable, and most directly for the concrete individual subject of the jobless archipelagos, for the Ivans and the Rahims, for all the pariahs. So basically, this Wynter takes Fanon's, as I mentioned before, notion of sociogeny, which is the concept that Fanon developed in Black Skins, White Masks, when she was analyzing the forms of alienation than the fellow Black Caribbeans were suffering in France when he was researching there. He was a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and Freud took the notion of biology of ontogeny, which studies the development of a species of from the inception, from the beginning. So if Freud took this notion of biology in psychology and psychiatry in order to analyze how a child, or from the inception of the human, when it's a baby or when it's a child, then produces certain traumas that then get manifested later on in life. Fanon understood that these complexes, traumas, and forms of alienation that the Black Caribbeans were suffering in France could not be understood at the individual level. They need to take into consideration the whole process of colonialism, slavery, and they need to take into account the kind of conditions that have been historically produced at the social level. And this is, and then Wynter takes this idea of sociogeny even further to not just look at these specific forms of alienation, but the way that a certain idea of the human has been, historically produced, and as we said before, constantly producing forms of segregation by deciding between death and life, between who it can be alive and who can be a dead human. Yeah, so governing life and death. So and this is so the Deciphering practices takes the existing inequalities of our order both as the expressive enactment of the governing code of life and death, and as the index of the rhetorical mystifications that must be at work in order to determine how the order should be normatively felt about and known. If the collective behaviors that brings the structuring processes of the order into being are to be dynamically induced and stably replicated. So there is, and this is very important for her. For her, deciphering doesn't is not a process of the mystification, but actually of looking at what mystification actually does and how it reproduces this kind of structural conception of the human. But as we have been look at it, they are produced, we are producing this, they are socially and culturally produced. And so then I want to go back. So, okay, so Sylvia Wynter give us a very good tool to try to understand through the process of deciphering how, for example, in the real of aesthetics, we produce a coherent whole. And through this coherent whole, which in some elements, they might have kind of progressive perspectives or ideologies, in reality, they produce a fucked up reality that that is, based on exploitation. So now I want to go back to Metzinger and to this notion of alienation from below, and the way that it produces this phantom subjectivity. So why is it that, so from the most kind of a structural kind of perspective that Sylvia Wynter gave us to the way that we accept it, why do we accept it? Why does it feel so simply natural to keep on going the way that we are? And this text of Thomas Metzinger, which is part of this compilation, which is analyzing kind of predictive processing in the philosophy of mind. So predictive processing is a kind of theory in cognition that, if Kant already said that we are through our categories producing the objects of what we are, in the process of perception, for predictive processing, it goes further and it says that we already have a model in which a set of expectations is already produced, and then we get some inputs that then might re-actualize the model to a certain extent, but it's like the model it's already having in place what things will be we will be perceiving. A set of expectations are already produced, and then it navigates and decides which kind of new input can we actually take and accept. And for me, this is really interesting because how is it this model produced? And this, like the way that, okay, there is this coherent kind of structural perception of reality, but then how do we perceive it and accept it at this very individual point? And actually, yeah, so it's like trying, and the mental autonomy is the kind of the most minimal, as far as I understand it, the most minimal point in which a level of agency is kind of produced. And then we'll go from the most kind of minimal form of agency into, what then he calls the agentive narrative through the, but we will see, So we have gone into the structural, and we'll go into the most kind of intimate, processes that occurs in ourselves. Does anybody have any question at the moment? I mean, no, I guess no. Okay, so I'll keep on going. So what is M autonomy. So M autonomy for Metzinger is a simple and empirically tractable concept. And in general, autonomy is often framed as the capacity for rational self-control of overt behavior, whereas the term M autonomy refers to the specific ability to control one's own mental function, like attention, episodic memory, planning, concept of formation, rational deliberation, decision-making, and so on. So if Sylvia Wynter was criticizing the concept of autonomy, not just in art, but in general, specifically, I guess, through understanding of modernity, but like certainly as the capacity for having an ability to execute rational control over an object, or to be differentiated from other objects, like for example in some kind of traditions of fine art. I guess especially I'm thinking of Clement Greenberg. So this, like, in fact, yeah, for me, Wynter probably is the most kind of the most developed critique that I come across, the most developed critique of formalism and the Clement, the Greenberg idea that that the work of art is self-sustained, it sustains itself, the idea of its own autonomy. So here we have, a perception of autonomy at the most minimal level in our own perception and mental activity. And then, what this minimal form of activity called this mental activity is within what he calls the agentive agency, what Metzinger calls agentive agency. So this seems to me like a kind of a level that is a bit more developed within our own level of autonomy. So consciously experience agentive agency is theoretically important because it is probably the earliest and simplest forms of experiencing oneself as a knowing self, as an epistemic agent. To consciously enjoy agentive agency means that one, the cognitive systems as a whole, currently identifies with the content of a particular self-representation that one operates under an epistemic agent model, active in one's own brain. So, okay, mental autonomy is maybe the first moment of a mental action that produce autonomy. That then agentive agency, it already requires that you have a knowing self, that you are able to perceive yourself as a knowing self. And this, well, the way that this knowing self is produced, as I said before, is through a process of transparency or immediacy. So if we saw that in commodity production, commodities appear to ourselves as immediate with certain capacities and qualities, here we have another form of immediacy or transparency that it makes it very difficult for us to perceive ourselves in a different way. And transparency for Metzinger is a property of conscious representations, namely that they are not experienced as representations. Therefore, the subject of experience has the feeling of being in direct and immediate contact with their content. Transparent conscious representations create the phenomenology of naive realism. An opaque phenomenal representation is one that is experienced as a representation, for example, in pseudo hallucinations or lucid dreams. So here we have, that which kind of produce the phenomenology of naive realism. But as we know, there is forms of noise that we are not able to basically experience or appreciate. So if the mental autonomy is inscribed into the agentive narrative, sorry, not the agentive narrative, the agentive agency, then the agentive agency is inscribed within the epistemic agent model. So, and the what is the epistemic agent model? Having an epistemic agent model is an instance of self-consciousness. For a human being, it means that subjectively, it now possesses a specific kind of self-knowledge, knowing that one knows and that one is able actively to control certain epistemic states. An epistemic agent model is a model of a single entity capable of autonomous epistemic self-control and ultimate origination. As this happens on the level of conscious processing, it also creates the phenomenology of ownership for certain states of perceptual and cognitive knowledge. So I think that something very interesting that Metzinger says is that we only have our epistemic agent model is only active a third of our life, a third part of our, of the time that we are living, So for example, when we are sleeping, we are not, the epistemic agent model is not activated. However, when we are, in reality, we are, when we are engaging with each other, we just take it as absolutely natural and transparent. And this is part of the problem of that which generates this idea of a whole that cannot be otherwise. That reality is what we take, but this epistemic agent model is also culturally produced. It's not biological, because it kind of starts from when, it actually starts to be activated between the age of 2 and 4, because it needs some, it needs to build an autobiographical kind of narrative. That's why we don't have memories from before the age of 2, because that autobiographical level is not yet developed. So, and how does it function? So this epistemic agent model is, it has 3 levels. First is the mind wandering network as an automatic subpersonal mechanism, constantly creating a dynamic internal affordance landscape. Second is the phenomenal self model as characterized by a hierarchy of predictive horizons or nested timescales, generating different types of representational content. And third is the concept of an epistemic agent model as one specific content layer in the phenomenal self model. The transient consciousness correlates to the event of achieving autonomous epistemic self-control. So these are the kind of levels that, the kind of, there is the network of these automatic subpersonal mechanisms. Then they get activated to meet this self-model, which has a model of what, a set of expectations and what is kind of, is already, expecting what kind of signal it will be getting. And then it meets the epistemic agent model that it has already built some biographical and ideas about what a conception, a self-conception of what we are. And this is really important, that they are not biological, they are not biological mechanisms. This cognitive agency and agentive agency are cultural processes. So they could be otherwise. The model could be radically different. So it is important to note that the cognitive agency as well as agentive agency are enculturated processes. One relevant cultural practice is that human beings educate their children by ascribing the capacity for better control. You could have refrained from doing this, and ultimate origination. You could have done this otherwise, right from the very beginning, and a stage where, from a scientific perspective, young children almost certainly do not possess these capacities. According to the predictive processing approach, this cultural practice will automatically become internally modeled, and the overall process will influence the gradual development of the children's epistemic agentive model. According to the predictive approach, this cultural practice will automatically become internally modeled, and the overall process will influence the gradual development of the child's epistemic agent model. All socially embedded predictive processing systems have to extract and exploit the causal structure of their sociocultural niche. They have to predict their caregivers' behavior. And the best resource for the generation and updating of hypotheses they have is their own internal self-model. And for me, I was thinking of like, okay, why do I think that social dissonance is so prevalent today? Is because the model that the previous models that we have built, they are not longer, they seem to be dated in order to deal with the reality that we are facing. Or let's put it another, in other terms, the kind of reality that we have is extremely dynamic and challenging traditional ways of how we've been conceiving historically. But we still have in place political systems that are still, quite old, and I think this is just kind of clashing into a breaking point. That's why I think many people want to turn to traditional modes of being by naturalizing things like the state, like gender, and and the family. They want, they don't want to deal with, they don't want to actualize the model. They want to go to a model that is like totally enclosed, and that it doesn't leave any room for contingency. They want to get rid of the noise that is happening. They don't want to deal with the dynamism of the way that reality is changing. So that's why I think we are in a breaking point. But otherwise, on the other hand, we don't have a system in place, legal system, or a kind of container for the kind of subject that will be able to deal with the conflict, contradictions, and noises that are emerging from the way that reality is changing, of this rapidly changing reality. Okay, so this agentive narrative, and I'm like it's already an hour. This is the last probably slide. So and here goes to this idea of Metzinger. He's going back to this idea that we are no one, that there is no such a thing as a self. So of course there is really no such a thing as a narrative self. Our inner life narrative has no author, no mysterious self behind the self that could function as the narrator. It too emerges out of a continuous process of dynamic self-organization and social interaction, leading to an ever-changing autobiographical self-model. But the process, just a sketch, has an important phenomenological effect. When autobiographical memory begins to consolidate, a strong hyper prior for autonomy and moral responsibility is already firmly established. We believe and automatically predict that we and others have the capacity for better control and ultimate origination, because it has always been like that since we can remember. We are embodied models of our early social environment. Our phenomenal self-models reflects implicit expectations of our primordial sociocultural niche, and that we have always been autonomous, morally responsible agents. This robust self-related hyperprior has been installed early through highly reliable social feedback, and it is a major factor in determining the phenomenology of self-consciousness and autonomy. So for me, this is really interesting because it points that, is this model that we have is absolutely able to adapt. It could be totally otherwise. But obviously this, it will need to be constructed, and it will get constructed. The question is like whether it will match the complexity and contingencies of the reality that we are living, or which will never be able to match one-to-one. Obviously, that's will be impossible, but it could, be closer to it, because if it doesn't, if it lags behind like the way it does behind right now, that the way that the model is being updated is too slow for actually being able to deal with reality properly. But here there is a huge gap between these two, the idea of this model and that is here, but what I'm trying to try to make sense is how this self-model, this model that we have, is determined by the social synthesis, by the semantic closure principle, by this kind of whole ideological constructions that determine what is possible and what is not possible in this reality. And I guess social dissonance is the gap that is produced by this conflict. But yeah, I'm trying to very humbly deal with this, but it's not easy. So yeah, it would be good to now open it. I have maybe later on we can do I have a listening exercise. I don't know if maybe this will be something interesting to do now, or as a way to kind of open it, or you would rather have now questions and then do this later on.